In the year 1212, Europe came up with one of the worst ideas in the history of bad ideas. After noble knights repeatedly failed to reclaim the Holy Land, a fresh thought spread: why not send an army of children? Obviously, their weapons wouldn't be swords or tactics, but their pure innocence and presumably the ability to complain relentlessly about all the walking. Leading this ill-advised parade were self-proclaimed prophet shepherd boys. In France, a boy named Stephen claimed to have a letter from Jesus himself. Meanwhile, in Germany, Nicholas of Cologne had an even bolder business plan. His plan, you asked, simple. The Mediterranean Sea would automatically part for them to cross. Easy enough. Tens of thousands of people desperate with poverty and belief in miracles actually bought into it. The story we're told is a Hollywood-level tragedy. The sea doesn't part, and the children either starve to death in the Alps or are sold into slavery by evil mustache-twirling merchants. It has everything: innocent heroes, one-dimensional villains, and a heavy-handed moral lesson. It's almost too perfect, and that's precisely the problem. What if this tragic story is actually just an elaborate fairy tale? What if there was no children's army at all, but something else entirely? Something far messier and far sadder. Welcome to Cursed Chambers, where we discover that history's most compelling lies are often created to hide a much more uncomfortable truth. The truth that sometimes you don't need an evil plot, just a really, really bad idea. All right, before we follow our pint-sized prophets on their doomed little road trip, we need to understand the world that cooked them up. Because a phenomenon as profoundly weird as the Children's Crusade doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It requires a very specific, very potent cocktail of misery, superstition, and institutional failure. Welcome to Europe 1212. First, let's get one thing straight. This wasn't the fairy tale medieval period of Disney movies. This was a world steeped in dirt, disease, and dread. The average life expectancy was abysmal. Infant mortality was terrifyingly high, and for the vast majority of people, life was a short, brutal grind defined by back-breaking labor and the constant gnawing threat of starvation. This wasn't a world of hope and opportunity. For most, it was a waiting room for the afterlife, and they were desperate for any sign that they were on the right list. On top of this baseline misery, the entire spiritual superstructure of society had recently suffered a catastrophic public relations disaster. I'm talking, of course, about the Fourth Crusade. Just 8 years earlier in 1204, an army of Europe's finest, most pious knights had set off to reclaim Jerusalem from the infidel. It was meant to be a glorious, holy war. Instead, through a series of politically inept and breathtakingly greedy decisions, they got sidetracked. They ended up not in the Holy Land, but at the gates of Constantinople, the biggest, richest Christian city in the world. And what did these soldiers of Christ do? They sacked it. For 3 days, the Knights of the Fourth Crusade murdered, looted, and desecrated the capital of their fellow Christians in an orgy of violence that shocked even the medieval world. Think about the optics. The men who were supposed to be the armed defenders of the faith had just proven themselves to be nothing more than a pack of greedy, murderous thugs. The moral authority of the entire crusading movement was left in tatters. The nobility was corrupt. The professional warriors were sinful. The system was broken. So if the rich and powerful couldn't get the job done, who could? This failure created a power vacuum, not on a battlefield, but in the popular imagination. And into that vacuum stepped a radical, dangerous idea. Maybe God wasn't interested in armies anymore. Maybe he was looking for someone else. Someone pure. This brings us to the rules of the game for the 13th century, which operated on a logic that is almost completely alien to us. To understand why thousands would follow a shepherd boy across a continent, you have to forget everything you know about cause and effect. In their world, miracles weren't just a possibility. They were an expected part of life. The veil between heaven and earth was thin, and God was a very hands-on manager who regularly intervened in human affairs, usually through signs, wonders, and the occasional plague. Walking on water, curing the sick, parting the seas. These weren't just stories from a holy book. They were things that could, in theory, happen again, provided you had the right kind of faith. The best way to think about it is like a viral social media challenge, but with much higher stakes. The algorithm wasn't TikTok, it was God. And going viral meant performing a public act of piety, so extreme, so undeniably pure, that enforced a divine response. This created a culture of competitive holiness. Who could be the most devout? Who could suffer the most for Christ? Who could perform a pilgrimage so audacious that God himself would have to sit up and take notice? And at the very top of this spiritual pyramid scheme were the paupers, the poor. In our world, poverty is a condition to be escaped. In their world, voluntary poverty was a status symbol. Jesus was poor, the apostles were poor. Therefore, being poor and powerless made you spiritually closer to God than any king or knight dripping in gold and sin. The pauperies were seen as possessing a special kind of spiritual currency. Their innocence was their superpower. This was the logic bomb ticking at the heart of European society. If the strong and wealthy knights had failed because of their sins, then it stood to reason that the weak and impoverished might succeed because of their purity. All it needed was a spark. All it needed was a leader. Enter our two protagonists. It's important to remember we know very little about them as individuals. They are figures of legend defined almost entirely by what others wrote about them. But from those chronicles, we can sketch out two very different, yet equally effective types of leaders. First, in France, we have Stephen of Cloyes. Think of him as the charismatic preacher, the grassroots influencer. He appears seemingly out of nowhere with a killer piece of celestial merchandise, a letter he claims delivered to him by Jesus Christ in a vision. The letter is addressed to the King of France, but of course only Stephen can really explain its true importance. How convenient. Now, was the letter real? Almost certainly not. But that's missing the point. In an illiterate society, desperate for a direct line to the divine, a physical object, a letter from God was a marketing masterstroke. It was tangible proof of his authority. Stephen wasn't just spouting ideas, he had a prop. He traveled the countryside, and his message was simple and intoxicating. The old ways have failed, but we, the pure, have been chosen. His appeal was emotional, built on a shared sense of grievance and a promise of divine vindication. Then across the Rhine in Germany, you have Nicholas of Cologne. If Stephen was the preacher, Nicholas was the tech CEO. He was less about emotional speeches and more about a single audacious product demonstration. He didn't just promise divine favor. He promised a specific, observable miracle. His pitch was breathtakingly simple. Follow me, and the Mediterranean Sea will part for us. This wasn't a vague promise of spiritual victory. This was a testable hypothesis. It was a tangible goal that captured the imagination in a way a simple letter couldn't. It was the medieval equivalent of promising to build a rocket to Mars. It was so bold, so insane, that it had to be divinely inspired, right? But the most important players in this story aren't Stephen or Nicholas. They were nothing. The key players were the anonymous thousands who made a choice. They were the hungry farmers, the disillusioned artisans, the wandering poor, the young men and women who looked at their grim, hopeless lives and then looked at the confident boy promising a miracle and decided to take the most desperate gamble of their lives. They chose to believe, and in doing so, they set in motion one of the strangest, saddest, and most misunderstood tragedies in history. They formed an army not of soldiers, but of hope, and began their long, doomed march south. So you have a continent simmering in a stew of piety and poverty, just waiting for a catalyst. Now we get to the story itself. The story as it's been passed down for centuries, polished and perfected into a heartbreaking epic of faith and folly. Before we can dismantle the myth, we have to admire its construction. This is the legend of the Children's Crusade, a tale told in 3 acts. Think of it as the original Fire Festival, but with more prayer and somehow even worse, logistics. Our story begins in the spring of 1212 in the fields of northern France. This is where we meet our first protagonist, Stephen of Cloyes, a shepherd boy who, like many ambitious young men, decided the best way to get ahead was to claim he had a direct line to the divine. As the story goes, Stephen was just minding his own business, tending his flock, when Jesus Christ himself appeared and handed him a letter for the French king. Now we have to pause here and appreciate the sheer audacity. There's no celestial postal service, no angelic FedEx. Jesus apparently chose this specific unknown boy as his personal courier. The letter Stephen claimed was a divine command for the King of France to launch a new, better crusade. And people bought it. They didn't just buy it, they flocked to it. Stephen began to preach, and his charisma, fueled by what was either genuine delusion or a stunning talent for performance, was electric. He performed miracles chronicles claim he made the blind see, though the standards for what counted as a miracle were, let's say, a little looser back then. He drew a crowd, and then the crowd became a movement. Chroniclers, likely with a heavy dose of exaggeration, claimed as many as 30,000 people joined him. They weren't soldiers, they were peasants, artisans, adolescents, and children, all swept up in the fervor. They abandoned their homes and their fields and began to march south towards the king. Their plan for food, water, and shelter seems to have been, God will provide, which historically speaking is a terrible catering strategy. This wasn't an organized army. It was a shambling, chaotic, beautiful, and utterly doomed parade of hope, heading towards its first great test, the sea. While Stephen was whipping up a frenzy in France, a completely separate but eerily similar movement was exploding across the Rhine in Germany. This one was led by our visionary CEO, Nicholas of Cologne. If Stephen's movement was built on a message, Nicholas's was built on a promise, a bigger, better, and far more specific miracle. He preached to vast crowds in Cologne, and his pitch was the single greatest elevator pitch of the 13th century. Follow me to Italy, and God will part the Mediterranean Sea for us. We will walk on dry land all the way to the Holy Land. The sheer glorious insanity of this promise was its greatest strength. It was so impossible it had to be true. Why would God give this boy such a vision if he didn't intend to follow through? Nicholas assembled an even larger following than Stephen, perhaps as many as 50,000 souls. His was a more organized affair, a great river of humanity that began to flow south with a clear, singular goal. But first, they had to cross the Alps. Here the tone of our legend darkens. This wasn't a pleasant hike. It was a brutal, merciless ordeal. The great, unorganized mass of people with no supplies and no experience in mountaineering was shattered by the journey. They faced starvation rock slides and the biting cold. It's said that for every person who made it over the mountains, 2 were left behind their bodies littering the snow-choked passes. This wasn't a holy procession anymore. It was a death march. The survivors who finally stumbled broken and starving into the green plains of northern Italy were a mere fraction of the mighty host that had left Germany. They were gaunt, ragged, and utterly spent, but they still had their hope. They had made it to Italy. Now all the sea had to do was cooperate. This is the final act of the legend where the last embers of hope are brutally extinguished. The story splits here, following our 2 groups to their separate tragic fates. First, let's return to Stephen and his followers. They arrive at the port city of Marseille, a great crowd of expectant faces staring out at the blue, unmoving water of the Mediterranean. They prayed, they sang hymns, they waited for the grand miracle, and they kept waiting. The sea being a large body of salt water governed by the laws of physics and not by the visions of a French shepherd boy, refused to part. Disappointment turned to despair. Just as all seemed lost, 2 local merchants stepped forward. Their names have come down to us in the chronicles as Hugh the Iron and William the Pig, names that don't exactly scream trustworthy. They offered out of the supposed goodness of their hearts to transport the entire movement to the Holy Land for free on 7 ships. It was the miracle they had been waiting for, just in a slightly different form. Of course, it was a trap. According to the legend, a storm immediately sank 2 of the ships off the coast of Sardinia, killing everyone on board. The other 5 sailed on not to the Holy Land, but to the slave markets of Algeria and Alexandria. The children who had survived the long march were betrayed and sold into a lifetime of bondage. It's a perfectly villainous ending. Meanwhile, in Italy, Nicholas's battered survivors faced their own moment of truth. They arrived in the city of Genoa expecting a hero's welcome. Instead, the Genoese authorities, seeing a giant horde of homeless beggars at their gates, basically told them to get lost. When the sea failed to part here as well, the movement fractured. Some stayed in Genoa. Another group marched to Pisa, where they were again met with disappointment. A determined remnant with Nicholas still at their head pushed onto Rome itself, hoping for the Pope's blessing. They got an audience with Pope Innocent III, one of the most powerful and intelligent popes of the Middle Ages. He was reportedly moved by their piety, but was also a pragmatist. He saw a humanitarian disaster in the making. He gently absolved them of their crusading vows and told them in no uncertain terms to go home. For the children, this was the final crushing blow. Their great adventure was over. Their divine mission was a failure. The long, agonizing journey back over the Alps was even deadlier than the first. Most never made it. They died of hunger, were preyed upon by bandits, or simply settled into servitude along the way, too weak to continue. Nicholas himself, the boy who had promised a miracle, was never seen again. He simply vanished into the fog of history. It's a powerful, devastating story. It's a neat, tidy narrative of innocence betrayed by a cruel world. It has clear heroes, cartoonish villains, and a tragic, memorable ending. And that right there should be your first clue that history has been telling us a bedtime story. All right. So we have our story, a heartbreaking cinematic epic filled with youthful prophets, cartoonishly evil slave traders, and thousands of lost children. It's a tale that has horrified and fascinated people for 800 years. It's neat, it's tidy, and it has a clear moral. And that is why we are now heading into the chamber. Because when a story from the Middle Ages is that neat and tidy, it's almost always a lie. History is rarely a clean narrative. It's a chaotic jumble of contradictory accounts, missing evidence, and human messiness. The legend of the Children's Crusade feels less like a historical event and more like a screenplay written by a committee to win an award for most tragic story ever. So let's do what we do here at Cursed Chambers. Let's treat this not as a settled story, but as a historical cold case. The witnesses are the monastic chroniclers. The evidence is buried in the translation of a single Latin word, and the crime scene is the collective psyche of 13th century Europe. Let's put on our gloves, open the case file, and separate the facts from the very, very effective fiction. Our investigation begins by putting the popular legend, the one we just told in Part 3, on the stand. This is the official story. We're challenging a literal army of young children marching to war who were betrayed and sold into slavery. Now let's bring in our evidence and see how well that story holds up under cross-examination. Exhibit A, the word, deconstructing pueri. The entire edifice of the Children's Crusade rests on a single 5-letter Latin word, pueri. For centuries, this has been translated quite reasonably as boys or children. And if you take that translation at face value, you get the story everyone knows. But this is a classic case of historical malpractice, translating a word without translating its world. In the rigid hierarchical society of the 13th century, pueri was a word with a double meaning. Yes, it could refer to young boys, but it was also used frequently and widely as a social descriptor for the lowest rung on the ladder, the paupers, the poor. This wasn't just about money, it was about status. The pueri were the landless peasants, the serfs, the wandering laborers, the vagrants, the powerless. They were in the eyes of the land-owning, literate nobility and clergy who wrote the chronicles, the little people. Calling a grown man a pure or boy was a way of reinforcing his low social standing, something that has echoes even today. So when a monastic chronicler writing from his comfortable abbey described a movement of pueri, he wasn't necessarily describing a column of 10-year-olds. He was describing a mass unauthorized pilgrimage of the rural poor. It was a social class on the move. Thinking of it as only children is like finding a 21st century document that says the masses rose up, and concluding that a group of literal religious masses floated out of churches and took to the streets. It misses the entire social context. This retranslation changes everything. This was not a school trip gone horribly wrong. This was a social and religious uprising of the dispossessed. Were there children involved? Absolutely. People traveled as families. There would have been adolescents, young adults, and yes, their children swept up in the movement. But it wasn't an army of kids from a storybook. It was an army of the desperate, a cross-section of the poorest and most marginalized members of society. The Children's Crusade is a mistranslation. It would be far more accurate to call it the Crusade of the Poor. Exhibit B, the motive, a pilgrimage, not a war. Our next piece of evidence challenges the second word in the title, crusade. When we hear that word, we think of war. We think of Richard the Lionheart of knights and swords and siege engines. But the movement of 1212 had none of that. They were, by all accounts, completely unarmed. Their entire plan seems to have been built around a profound and deliberate rejection of violence. Let's look at the context we established in Part 2. The Fourth Crusade had been a moral train wreck. The official noble-led violent approach to crusading was seen as a corrupt failure. This new movement was a direct response to that. It was a protest. It was an attempt at a different kind of crusade altogether, a peaceful one. Their goal wasn't to fight the Saracens, it was to convert them. The logic, as bizarre as it sounds to us, was that the sheer spectacle of their faith and purity would be so overwhelming that the Muslims of the Holy Land would voluntarily lay down their arms and accept Christianity. The parting of the sea wasn't a strategic move to get an army across the water. It was the divine sign that would validate their mission and demonstrate God's power to the world, leading to this mass peaceful conversion. Stephen's letter wasn't a call to arms for the king. It was a plea for a new kind of holy leadership, one based on piety, not power. This reframes the entire event. It wasn't a failed military campaign. It was a failed spiritual and social movement. They weren't bad soldiers. They weren't soldiers at all. They were pilgrims engaged in an act of what they called peregrinatio pro Christo, a wandering for Christ. Their failure wasn't their inability to fight. It was the world's inability to live up to their impossible, miraculous expectations. Exhibit C, the villains, inventing the slavers. Now for the most dramatic part of the legend, the evil merchants, Hugh the Iron and William the Pig and the 7 ships sailing to the slave markets of North Africa. It's a horrifying, memorable, and incredibly effective piece of storytelling. It also appears to be complete fiction. When you examine the chronicles, the primary sources for this event, a fascinating pattern emerges. The sources written at the time of the Crusade in 1212 and in the years immediately following mention the marches, the leaders, the hardship, and the eventual disintegration of the groups. They do not mention a mass systematic betrayal and the selling of thousands into slavery. That juicy cinematic detail gets added to the story much later. The main source for the tale of the treacherous merchants is a chronicler named Alberic of Trois-Fontaines, who was writing around the year 1250, nearly 4 decades after the fact. By then, the actual events had faded into folklore. The question of what happened to all those people lingered. A slow, miserable end from starvation and disease is a deeply unsatisfying answer. It's messy and lacks a clear villain. But a story about a deliberate evil betrayal. Now that has legs. It provides a simple answer to a complex question. It creates clear-cut villains so you know who to blame. The almost cartoonishly evil names, Hugh the Iron, William the Pig, sound far more like characters from a folk ballad than actual 13th century merchants. By inventing this narrative, later chroniclers transformed a complex social phenomenon into a simple morality play. It was a better story, but it wasn't better history. It was a narrative patch slapped over a historical whole to make it more compelling and to serve as a powerful cautionary tale for future generations about trusting strangers. So if we strip away the mistranslation of Pueri, the misunderstanding of Crusade, and the fictional story of the slavers, what are we left with? What really happened? We are left with the real cursed chamber of this story, and it isn't a place, it's a perfect storm of historical forces, a deadly convergence of human desperation and belief. The real curse had 3 key ingredients. First was economic desperation. The years leading up to 1212 were marked by crop failures, famine and intense poverty in parts of France and Germany. For thousands of people, life was already a dead end. They had nothing. When a charismatic leader comes along and offers a miraculous escape, a divine lottery ticket out of a miserable existence, the risk of following him seems minuscule compared to the certain misery of staying behind. This wasn't a jolly adventure. It was an exodus born of hopelessness. Second was religious hysteria. This desperation was ignited by an intense apocalyptic spiritual worldview. People genuinely believed the end times were near and that God's intervention was imminent. The line between a prophet and a madman was dangerously thin, and in a climate of fear and anticipation, a message like Stephen's or Nicholas's could spread like wildfire. It was the medieval version of a moral panic, where collective anxiety found an outlet in a dramatic public performance of faith. Finally, was systemic failure. The traditional power structures that were supposed to provide stability and spiritual guidance had failed. The feudal lords offered little protection from famine. The institutional church, embroiled in politics and still reeling from the PR disaster of the Fourth Crusade, seemed distant and corrupt to the common person. This created a vacuum of leadership and trust, a vacuum that charismatic, unauthorized figures like Stephen and Nicholas were perfectly positioned to fill. They offered a direct personal connection to God that bypassed the failed institutions. This was the true cursed chamber, not a slave ship, but a moment in time when poverty, piety, and powerlessness collided. The real tragedy of the Crusade of the Poor is not that they were betrayed by a couple of evil men. The real tragedy is that they weren't. There was no single dramatic end. Their movement simply and slowly fell apart under the crushing weight of reality. They died of disease in the squalid camps that formed around them. They died of starvation trying to cross the mountains. They were scattered by disappointed towns who saw them not as holy pilgrims, but as a dangerous swarm of vagrants. They were turned away at port cities, and when the sea failed to part, their collective hope shattered into 1,000,000 individual shards of despair. Some limped home. Some were forced into servitude to survive. Many just vanished, their names and stories lost forever. They weren't consumed by a monstrous act of evil. They were consumed by the mundane, grinding cruelty of the world. And that is a far deeper, more disturbing, and ultimately more human tragedy than any legend. So we have opened the case file, examined the evidence, and dismantled the legend piece by piece. The cinematic tale of a literal children's army betrayed by cartoon villains dissolves under the harsh light of historical scrutiny. Where does that leave us? It leaves us with the verdict on the 800-year-old cold case of the Children's Crusade. Let's be clear. The Children's Crusade was not a crusade, and it was not primarily an army of children. What took place in 1212 was a series of spontaneous, chaotic, and ultimately doomed popular pilgrimages. The participants were not soldiers, but the pueri, the rural poor, the landless, the disenfranchised of society. Driven by a potent combination of apocalyptic religious fervor and profound economic desperation, they marched not for war, but for a miracle. They believed their collective purity and poverty gave them a spiritual authority that the wealthy, sinful knights of the official crusades lacked. Their end was not a single dramatic act of betrayal on the docks of Marseille. There were no evil slave traders named Hugh the Iron or William the Pig. They are ghosts of a later, more convenient narrative. The real end was a slow, agonizing disintegration. It was a tragedy of 1,000 small cuts. It was death by starvation in the frozen passes of the Alps. It was death by disease in the squalid camps that sprung up around them. It was the crushing spiritual death of disillusionment when the seas failed to part and the heavens remained silent. They were not sold into oblivion. They simply faded into it, their hopes extinguished by the cold, hard indifference of the world. And yet that is not the story that survived. This is perhaps the most fascinating part of the echo. The messy, complicated truth of a social movement born of desperation was quickly overwritten by the much simpler, more useful myth of innocent children betrayed by evil men. Why? Because the myth served a purpose. For the authorities of the day, the church and the nobility, the real story was dangerous. The idea that thousands of the poor could spontaneously organize and march across the continent because the system had failed them was a terrifying thought. It was a direct challenge to their authority. But the story of naive children being tricked by a few wicked individuals, that was a manageable narrative. It became a powerful cautionary tale, a tool to discourage future unauthorized popular movements and reinforce the idea that the common folk should leave matters of importance to their betters. Over the centuries, the story was further romanticized. The grit, grime, and desperation of its origins were washed away. The starving, ragged pauperies were replaced in art and literature by rosy-cheeked, innocent children, turning a stark tale of social collapse into a beautiful, poignant fable about lost innocence. The real people were forgotten, their complex motivations erased, because history, like Hollywood, often prefers a simple, tragic hero to a complicated, desperate one. The legend became far more powerful and influential than the reality ever was. Ultimately, the enduring power of the Children's Crusade legend tells us more about ourselves than it does about the 13th century. It reveals our profound, almost desperate need for clear narratives in the face of chaos. We prefer the simple, dramatic lie over the complex, messy truth. Why? Because the lie is easier. The myth of the Children's Crusade gives us clear villains to hate and innocent victims to pity. It allows for a clean, emotional transaction, but the truth is deeply uncomfortable. The truth involves systemic failure, the devastating consequences of climate and famine, and the terrifying power of mass delusion. There are no mustache-twirling villains to blame, only a broken society and the flawed, desperate people within it. That is a much more disturbing reality to confront, for it suggests that catastrophe doesn't always require malice. Sometimes it just requires a sufficient quantity of misery and bad ideas. The story of these movements is a brutal lesson in what happens when established institutions fail to provide hope. When people feel they have no future and that their leaders are corrupt or indifferent, they will manufacture their own hope. They will seek out their own profits. They will believe in their own miracles, no matter how irrational, because the alternative, believing in nothing at all, is simply unbearable. The real cursed chamber here was not a dungeon or a slave ship. It was the empty space in society where hope was supposed to be. The curse wasn't a supernatural force that doomed these marchers. The curse was the world. They lived in a world so harsh, so unforgiving, and so devoid of other options that a suicidal pilgrimage across a continent seemed like the most logical choice. And that is a tragedy far more profound than any storybook tale of betrayal. What do you think is the most misunderstood event in history? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to unlock more of history's cursed chambers, be sure to subscribe. The past is always waiting to be